The tow truck engine roared just as Grandpa stepped outside in his slippers with a mug of black coffee, and froze. There, in broad daylight, his 1959 Ford F-100 was already halfway down the street, chained up and scraping pavement. He didn't yell. He didn't drop his coffee. He just turned around, walked inside, and muttered one word into the phone. Sheriff. Everyone in the county knew about Earl Granite Hawkins. Retired war vet, ex-deputy sheriff, and the kind of man who could fix an engine with duct tape and discipline. His truck wasn't just some old vehicle, it was his soul on wheels. He'd spent 2 years restoring it after his wife passed, piece by piece, every bolt a therapy session. He washed it every Sunday morning, polished it with a rag from his Navy days, and parked it in his driveway like it was part of the house. No one had ever dared to mess with it, until now. The neighborhood had been peaceful for years until Karen Witherspoon took over as HOA president. Newly retired, overly caffeinated, and armed with laminated rulebooks, she had transformed into a suburban tyrant. Her latest vendetta? Restoring the aesthetic purity of the neighborhood. And apparently, Grandpa's classic Ford didn't make the cut. We all knew she had it out for him. She once fined him for having his porch light too bright. Another time, she said his American flag was too aggressive. But this was war. She hadn't left a warning. No notice. No phone call. Just had her cousin's tow company hook up the truck and drag it out of our lives while Grandpa was making toast. It felt like something had been stolen from the whole family. When I pulled into the driveway minutes later, Grandpa was sitting on the porch. He didn't say much. Just stared down the street like he was watching a chessboard and waiting for the next move. I asked if he was okay, and he gave that crooked smile, the one he used before a fishing prank or blowing up a wasp nest with firecrackers. That smile always meant trouble. "I made a call," he said calmly. "This ain't over." And it wasn't. Within an hour, Sheriff Dalton showed up in his cruiser, sipping sweet tea like it was a weekend barbecue. He and Grandpa had served together back in the day and stayed close ever since. The moment Dalton heard about the tow, he started chuckling, not because it was funny, but because he'd seen this play out before. "You know she can't legally do that without proper HOA authorization and vehicle classification forms, right?" the sheriff asked. Grandpa nodded. "Thought so," he replied. "You want to make some calls?" "Oh, I'm making 'em right now," Dalton said, already dialing. Turns out, Karen's cousin's tow company was not only unlicensed for residential vehicle removal, but they'd already racked up several complaints across the county for illegal tows and overbilling. Worse, Grandpa's truck had a noticeable dent in the rear bumper from the botch tow, a bumper he hand-welded himself with his buddy Louie, who passed last fall. We went down to the impound lot the same afternoon. Grandpa was quiet most of the ride, but you could see the gears turning. The lot was fenced in, guarded by a guy who looked like he hadn't blinked since 2003. But when he saw Sheriff Dalton's badge and Grandpa's death glare, the gate creaked open. The truck was sitting crooked, axle clearly misaligned, paint chipped from chain burns. Grandpa walked around it in silence, ran a finger across the scratch on the hood, then wiped it on his jeans. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just looked at the impound guy and said, "Get your manager." The sheriff took pictures, documented the damage, and informed the lot manager that the truck had been towed illegally. They stammered something about HOA paperwork, but the sheriff cut them off. "No valid tow authorization. No posted notice. And you dragged a classic vehicle with no dollies," he said, flipping his notebook shut. "You're gonna want to call your lawyer." We got the truck released that same evening, but Grandpa didn't drive it home. He had it loaded onto a rollback tow truck, properly this time, and said he was taking it to a friend's garage. "Let's get her fixed up first," he said. "Then we'll bring her back with company." That night, he stayed up late in the shed with his old radio playing Johnny Cash. I saw him flipping through papers, making lists, calling old friends, People from the sheriff's department, the county clerk's office, even a local news anchor who owed him a favor after he pulled her car out of a ditch last winter. This wasn't just about getting his truck back. This was about principle. Karen, meanwhile, was walking around the neighborhood like she'd won a gold medal. She waved smugly at neighbors, said things like, "Good riddance," and "finally some standards around here," and even took photos of other violations she planned to target next. She had no idea the storm coming her way had a chrome bumper and tail fins. By morning, Grandpa had already drafted a legal notice to the HOA. He cited their own bylaws, county vehicle codes, and even included past HOA meeting transcripts showing Karen had never received formal board approval for emergency enforcement actions. In short, she acted completely alone, and illegally. He handed me a copy of the notice and said, "Tomorrow, we're serving her and the whole board." "What's the plan?" I asked. "First, we fix the truck. Then, we roll in like it's a homecoming parade. And after that?" Grandpa leaned back in his chair, stretched, and said, "After that, we clean house." I couldn't sleep that night. Not because I was nervous, but because I was excited. For the first time in years, the community had a reason to rally. Grandpa wasn't just defending a truck. He was defending every resident who'd ever been steamrolled by petty power. The HOA had poked the wrong bear. And that bear? He was about to roar. The neighborhood looked the same the next morning, but it didn't feel the same. Behind the trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, something had shifted. Word spread fast. Grandpa's truck had been towed without notice, the sheriff had gotten involved, and now Karen, the queen of HOA chaos, had a serious problem on her hands. But instead of backing down, she did what all true power-hungry bureaucrats do when caught red-handed: she doubled down. Before sunrise, Karen and her clipboard were already making rounds. She slapped fresh notices on mailboxes, claimed the HOA had voted in an emergency amendment banning all non-modern, non-electric vehicles from being parked in driveways. It was nonsense, obviously, a desperate move to cover her tracks. The amendment had no official backing, no resident input, and, most importantly, no legal leg to stand on. But it didn't stop her. She even posted a message in the community Facebook group announcing a new neighborhood beautification blitz, using vague buzzwords and photoshopped images of eco-friendly cars. It was as if she was trying to erase every bit of personality from the community and replace it with a glossy brochure version of suburbia. Grandpa didn't even blink. While Karen polished her power trip, he was already 10 steps ahead. His truck had been towed to his old friend's shop, a place called Mac's Auto Revival, tucked just outside city limit. Mac was a legend in his own right, a grizzled gearhead who could rebuild an engine with a beer in one hand and a socket wrench in the other. The moment Grandpa rolled the truck in, Mac took one look at the axle damage, let out a low whistle, and said, "They're gonna regret this." Grandpa and Mac worked side by side in that garage like they were building a war machine. Every dent fixed, every bolt checked, every scratch repainted with care. It wasn't just repair. It was restoration, therapy, and a declaration of defiance all rolled into one. By the end of the day, the truck looked cleaner than it had in years. Mac even installed a hidden dash cam in case Karen ever got bold again. Meanwhile, Grandpa made more calls. Old law buddies, a county zoning officer, even the regional DMV. He was stitching together a legal case so tight it could choke a snake. Back at home, I got a visit from Mrs. Delgado, a sweet woman who lived 3 doors down. She looked worried and handed me a notice Karen had left on her porch. It was a fine, for having unsanctioned lawn decor, which apparently referred to the pink flamingo statues her late husband had bought her on their anniversary. Delgado had tears in her eyes. She said they were tacky, that they don't meet community standards, but they're all I have left of him. I promised we were working on something. That soon, Karen wouldn't have the authority to bully anyone again. More neighbors started talking. The Zimmermans were threatened with a citation for parking their RV in the driveway for more than 12 hours. Penguins were fined for having excessive foliage. A single dad on the next street over got a warning because his teenage son's basketball hoop obstructed the visual harmony. Karen had gone off the rails. Grandpa knew this wasn't just about one truck anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who was too tired, too scared, or too polite to push back. He brought out a dusty box from the attic filled with old files, copies of HOA bylaws, property deeds, and minutes from HOA meetings dating back 10 years. He laid them all out on the dining table and started cross-referencing Karen's violations. That's when we found it, the smoking gun. Karen had never been formally voted in as HOA president. The previous president had resigned quietly, and Karen had simply assumed control, citing an emergency succession clause that didn't exist. The board she claimed to lead? Half of them had never even attended a meeting. The rest had either moved away or resigned months ago. Legally, Karen was a one-woman dictatorship with no authority to pass amendments, collect dues, or tow vehicles. Grandpa took that information and made copies. Then he drove to the county clerk's office to confirm it with property record. It checked out. She had no legal standing. Not one shred. As if that wasn't enough, we discovered that the tow company Karen used, Precision Removal Services, was owned by her cousin Randy, a man with a long list of consumer complaints and a license currently under review. One online review even claimed Randy once towed a car with a dog still inside. Another claimed he operated after hours without city permit. Grandpa handed all this over to Sheriff Dalton, who raised an eyebrow and said, "This is starting to look real messy." The sheriff agreed to escalate the matter and assigned a deputy to begin gathering evidence. Karen's attempt to enforce a new vehicle rule without a legal vote? Violation. Her financial dealings with a family member's business? Conflict of interest. Her fines without HOA board approval? Fraud. What started as a truck tow was now spiraling into a full-blown investigation. But Grandpa wasn't stopping there. He scheduled a private meeting with a local attorney named Fiona Lane, someone he knew from his deputy days. Fiona specialized in community association law, and when she saw the evidence, she nearly spit out her coffee. She offered to draft a petition to dissolve the current HOA leadership entirely and establish a temporary oversight committee while investigations were underway. Grandpa asked if the neighbors could vote for that committee. Fiona smiled and said, "Not only can they, they'll love it." Meanwhile, Karen was still strutting around the neighborhood like she was queen of the cul-de-sac. She had no idea that the sheriff's office was quietly pulling her phone records, financial transactions, and HOA communications. She thought she had won. She thought Grandpa was finished. That's when Grandpa told me his next plan. "We're bringing the truck back." I asked how, and he leaned in, grinning like a teenager about to TP someone's house. "We're bringing it back with the sheriff's convoy." "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," he said. "We'll have the sheriff, deputies, Mac, the whole vintage truck club, maybe even some news crews. We're rolling in legal and loud." The vision was too good to resist. A full convoy of vintage vehicles, blaring horns and waving flags, rolling past Karen's perfectly trimmed hedges while her laminated citations fluttered in the wind. It was poetic justice, and it was coming fast. Karen thought she'd silenced a man by taking his truck. But all she did was wake a storm. And by the time she realized what was coming, it would be too late to run. The sun had barely risen when a low rumble echoed through the neighborhood, the kind of sound that made curtains twitch and coffee cups pause mid-sip. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't construction. It was Grandpa's truck, polished to perfection and purring like a lion, leading a slow-moving convoy of vintage vehicles, patrol cruisers, and a news van down Maplewood Lane. At the front sat Grandpa, one hand on the wheel, the other waving calmly to the neighbors as if he were just returning from a grocery run. Behind him, Mac followed in a restored '68 Dodge Charger, and beside that rolled a pair of sheriff's deputies in uniform cruisers, lights on but sirens silent. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a statement. Karen stood at the end of her driveway in a floral robe and slippers, holding her phone like it was a weapon. Her eyes darted between the trucks, the camera crew, and the sheriff himself, who calmly stepped out of his vehicle and tipped his hat in her direction. She looked like someone who had just realized the fire she'd started had circled back with gasoline. She opened her mouth to speak, but Grandpa rolled right past her, parking his Ford squarely in his driveway, exactly where it had been before she'd stolen it. The crowd that had formed, neighbors, passers-by, and a few curious HOA board members, clapped and cheered like it was a 4th of July parade. The news crew wasted no time interviewing Grandpa. They caught every angle, him stepping out of the truck, patting the hood, and explaining calmly that he wasn't making a scene. He was reclaiming his property. The sheriff confirmed the legality of the action, explaining that the original tow had been performed without proper authorization and that pending investigations were underway. Karen tried to insert herself into the interview, yelling something about HOA bylaws, but the reporter politely reminded her that she was under investigation and should probably not comment without legal counsel. She turned red, then stormed inside. But the drama wasn't over. Karen had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting that very afternoon at the clubhouse, clearly hoping to regroup and do damage control. She plastered notices on every mailbox and sent out frantic emails to homeowners demanding attendance. What she didn't expect was for Grandpa to show up too, with a printed copy of the bylaws, Fiona Lane, and a petition signed by over 70% of the residents calling for her immediate removal as president. She also didn't expect the sheriff to be there, nor the 2 city officials from the housing office who had been monitoring the situation closely. The meeting was tense from the start. Karen tried to assert control, banging a gavel she must have ordered off Amazon and calling the meeting to order. But the sheriff raised his hand and gently interrupted. He informed everyone present that due to multiple confirmed irregularities in Karen's leadership, including unapproved expenditures, failure to follow protocol, and a breach of procedural ethics, the HOA's governance was now under formal review. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen stood frozen for a moment, then blurted out something about false accusations and vendettas. Her voice shook, and her hands flailed as she attempted to defend herself. That's when Grandpa stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply walked to the front of the room and laid down a series of documents on the table, copies of the HOA charter, highlighted sections of illegal actions, screenshots of Karen's edited communications, and a notarized letter from the former HOA president confirming that Karen had never been voted in as his replacement. Then he presented the petition and looked around the room. "I didn't want this," he said. "I just wanted to live in peace, park my truck, and enjoy my days like the rest of you. But when someone takes that away, not just from me, but from every one of you, it becomes something else. It becomes a fight worth having." The silence that followed was heavy. Karen opened her mouth again, but this time the city official cut her off. "We've seen enough," he said. "Effective immediately, this board is suspended pending review. All enforcement actions are frozen. Any further HOA communication must go through approved channels. And Ms. Witherspoon, we suggest you retain an attorney." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around the room for support, but there was none. Even the few who once supported her sat with their arms crossed or stared down at the table. She slumped into her chair, defeated. The gavel rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. Outside, the crowd that had gathered near the clubhouse entrance erupted in cheers as word spread. Grandpa stepped outside, and a group of kids ran up to him, shouting, "You did it, Mr. Hawkins!" One of them even handed him a small toy truck with a star sticker on the side. Grandpa took it with a chuckle and slipped it into his shirt pocket like it was a medal. That evening, the neighborhood felt lighter, almost festive. Neighbors came out of their homes, shook hands, shared drinks, and for the first time in a long time, actually talked to one another. Grandpa hosted an impromptu cookout on the lawn, grilling ribs while Mac and the sheriff shared old war stories and laughed like teenagers. People brought side dishes. Kids rode their bikes freely again. Even Mrs. Delgado brought out her pink flamingos and proudly planted them on her lawn with a little sign that read, HOA approved by Grandpa. Karen, however, remained in her house with the blinds drawn. A for sale sign appeared in her yard the next morning. But Grandpa wasn't finished. He called for a new election, not just to appoint an interim HOA board, but to permanently change how things were done. No more secret amendments. No more shady fines. Transparent meetings. Public budgets. Monthly cookouts. Fiona helped draft the new structure, and the whole community voted in favor within a week. They even asked Grandpa to lead the board, but he politely declined. "I've got enough miles on me," he said, flipping a burger. "Let the next generation steer. Just make sure they know how to drive stick." By the time the sheriff left that night, he shook Grandpa's hand and laughed. "I haven't seen a takedown that clean since we busted that bootlegging ring in '84. Grandpa raised his soda can and grinned. "Difference is, this one had better barbecue." The convoy had returned, the truck was back in its rightful place, and the neighborhood had found something better than peace. It found its voice. And the man who parked his pride and joy in the same spot every morning had made sure no one would ever try to silence that voice again. The morning after Karen's downfall, the neighborhood woke up to a very different kind of energy. The usual whispers about lawn heights and hedge symmetry were replaced with laughter and the occasional sound of lawn chairs being dragged onto front porches. For the first time in months, people didn't feel like they were being watched. The fear that had hovered over the community like a storm cloud was gone, swept away by one man and his old Ford pickup. But even though the air felt lighter, Grandpa wasn't celebrating just yet. He knew better than anyone that snakes don't always die on the first strike. Some of them just slither into the grass and wait for another moment to bite. True to form, Karen didn't go down quietly. Within 2 days of the HOA board being suspended, she filed a complaint with the city zoning office claiming that Grandpa's truck violated noise ordinances. She sent emails to every homeowner, insisting the community had been hijacked by a rogue faction, and accused Grandpa of turning the neighborhood into a hillbilly playground. She even hinted at suing for harassment, defamation, and unlawful removal, hoping to stir up doubt and fear. But the residents had had enough. Every single one of her emails was met with silence, or the quiet satisfaction of a delete button. Meanwhile, the investigation launched by the sheriff's office was in full swing. Deputy Ruiz was assigned to the case, and he took it seriously. He visited the HOA office, which was really just a converted closet in the community clubhouse, and started cataloging everything: boxes of receipts, financial ledgers, meeting notes, and USB drives that hadn't been touched in years. Fiona Lane assisted as a legal observer, making sure everything was documented and processed cleanly. What they found only confirmed what everyone suspected. Karen had been using HOA funds to pay her cousin's tow company, labeling the payments under vague descriptions like security vehicle relocation and community asset protection. There were over 30 transactions, none of which had approval from the board or community vote. It got worse. There were checks written for printing services that were never rendered, personal Amazon orders disguised as office supplies, and thousands spent on landscaping that never actually happened. One receipt showed a payment for decorative upgrades, which, after a little digging, turned out to be the patio furniture now sitting in Karen's backyard. The HOA wasn't just mismanaged, it was looted. The sheriff's department compiled their findings into a formal report, and by the end of the week, Karen was served with an official notice of investigation. Her bank accounts were flagged, her cousin's tow company was issued a cease and desist, and the neighborhood buzzed with the kind of unity no one had thought possible just a month ago. And still, Grandpa remained calm through it all. No gloating, no victory laps. Just steady, quiet resolve. He'd fought too many battles in his life to think this one was over. Karen, now cornered, tried one last desperate move. She hired an attorney. Some guy from the city who probably thought this was a quick paycheck and a simple PR cleanup. He issued a public statement claiming Karen had only ever acted in the best interest of the community and that she was being unfairly persecuted by a personal vendetta. The statement tried to paint Grandpa as a bitter old man who held a grudge against authority and had manipulated others into attacking a woman simply trying to uphold neighborhood standard. But the residents weren't buying it. They remembered the fines for lawn decor, the threats for having the wrong shade of mailbox paint, the citations for wind chimes and garden gnomes. They remembered Karen peeking over fences with her clipboard and knocking on doors uninvited. They remembered how she smiled when issuing penalties and how she always seemed to act alone. Grandpa didn't have to say a word. The people remembered the truth. The city council eventually weighed in. Because Karen had used HOA funds for personal gain and bypassed election protocol, she was banned from holding any HOA leadership role in the county ever again. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the misused funds, and her home, yes, the one she laced with unauthorized HOA decorations, was quietly listed for sale. She didn't even host an open house. She just packed her things and left one morning, her car trunk stuffed with boxes, her front lawn gnome broken in two. In her place, a new interim HOA board was formed, voted in by the residents with overwhelming support. This time, the elections were public, transparent, and conducted with proper legal oversight. And while everyone wanted Grandpa to be the president, he declined again with a smile and a firm handshake. "I'll be your watchdog," he said, pointing to his truck. "But let someone else hold the clipboard." So they made him the official community advisor, a role created just for him. He didn't have to attend every meeting or read every line of bylaws. His only job was to be there when something didn't feel right. And everyone agreed, if Grandpa said it didn't feel right, then it wasn't. The board got to work immediately. They removed every bogus rule Karen had forced through, held town hall-style meetings where residents could speak freely, and launched a neighborhood cleanup project. Not to sanitize the place, but to rebuild the community spirit. Flower beds were replanted. Driveways were pressure-washed. Lawn chairs appeared on porches again. People started waving at each other. Even the kids formed a Saturday bike club, complete with paper name tags and makeshift helmets made from cereal boxes. Grandpa's truck sat proudly in its driveway every morning, the sun gleaming off its fresh coat of paint. He added a new decal to the bumper that read, "Still here." It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was a symbol, a battle flag. When people passed by, they'd honk or give a thumbs up, and Grandpa would tip his cap without saying a word. He didn't have to. One evening, just after sunset, the sheriff stopped by with a case of root beer and a stack of paperwork. He and Grandpa sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. "Never thought a truck would be the thing to shake this place up," the sheriff said, popping the cap off his drink. Grandpa chuckled. "Wasn't the truck. It was the people. They just needed a little reminder." "Think she'll come back? Karen?" "Not a chance," Grandpa said. "She's allergic to accountability." They clinked bottles and sat in silence for a while. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and wind chimes jingled from a neighbor's porch. It was peaceful, but it wasn't quiet. It was alive. Grandpa leaned back and looked at his truck, the metal catching the moonlight just right. He didn't say it out loud, but we all knew what he was thinking. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the beginning. Because as long as there were clipboards, rules, and people who thought power came from a title, there'd be folks like Grandpa, ready to remind them where it really came from. The 1-year anniversary of the Great Towback, as the neighborhood had lovingly dubbed it, came with more excitement than anyone expected. It started with a flyer slipped into every mailbox. Not a fine, not a complaint, but an invitation. Community barbecue and car show, celebrating the return of the truck that brought us together. It was signed by the new HOA board and backed by nearly every household on the block. At the bottom was a hand-drawn cartoon of Grandpa's truck with a little crown on the hood. It was simple, honest, and full of the kind of warmth that had been missing from the neighborhood before the storm. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and by noon, folding chairs lined the sidewalk. Families poured out with coolers, kids rode bikes with streamers trailing from the handlebars, and someone had even hired a local band to play old-school rock and blues from a makeshift stage in the park. Grandpa, of course, was the guest of honor, and he rolled in fashionably late behind the wheel of his fully restored 1959 Ford F-100, freshly polished and gleaming like it had just come off a movie set. The crowd erupted into cheers as he parked in the designated center space, right beneath a banner that read, "Respect is earned, not elected." Grandpa stepped out in his classic boots and button-up shirt, sunglasses on, and a grin that made him look 20 years younger. The sheriff showed up moments later with a certificate of appreciation from the county, joking that it was the least they could do for a man who'd done more for community law and order than most elected officials in the last decade. A local reporter snapped photos, asking Grandpa what advice he had for anyone dealing with an overreaching HOA. He paused, adjusted his hat, and said, "Don't start fights, but finish 'em with the truth." The smell of grilled meat filled the air as Mac manned the smoker, flipping ribs like a maestro. Families brought potluck dishes, pies, drinks, and every kind of side dish imaginable. Someone had even brought a sheet cake shaped like a Ford truck, with frosting flames licking up the sides and long "May You Park" piped in blue icing across the top. Even the most reserved neighbors were laughing and telling stories. What used to be a collection of isolated homes had turned into a real community, thanks to a ridiculous injustice and one stubborn old man who refused to be pushed around. But as the celebration rolled on, a twist none of us expected unfolded. A moving truck pulled up on the far end of the street and began unloading boxes into Karen's old house. A new family had bought the property. A retired couple named Dennis and Loretta who had spent years living in the city and were finally ready to settle into a quiet neighborhood. They'd heard about the past drama, of course. It had become something of a local legend, but they were all smiles and warm handshakes, clearly relieved to know that the dictatorship was over and real people now ran the HOA. Grandpa walked over to introduce himself. Loretta immediately recognized him from the news clip she'd watched before buying the house. "You're the truck guy," she said, laughing. "The Sheriff Convoy guy." "That's me," Grandpa replied. "And don't worry, this place has turned around. You'll love it here now." Dennis grinned and added, "As long as nobody tells me what color to paint my shed, I'll be just fine." "Freedom to paint your shed any color you want," Grandpa said, shaking his hand. "That's our new motto." Later that afternoon, as the car show portion kicked off, Grandpa's truck wasn't the only star. Residents brought out their own vehicles. Restored motorcycles, a cherry red Mustang, even a beat-up old VW van someone had converted into a mobile lemonade stand. People voted for their favorites with little clothespins and index card. In the end, Grandpa's truck still took first place, but he insisted on handing the prize, an engraved grill spatula, to the 12-year-old who had entered a souped-up go-kart decorated with rainbow LEDs and stickers that read "Karen Free Zone." As dusk settled in, tiki torches lit up the park and the band played a slow, heartfelt song that had more than a few folks getting teary-eyed. Grandpa sat near the truck with a root beer in one hand, surrounded by kids asking questions about the engine, the paint job, and whether or not it had rocket launchers. He played along, of course, swearing them to secrecy before whispering, "Only if someone tries to tow it again." That's when the final surprise of the night was unveiled. The new HOA board had worked with a local artist to create something permanent, something that would remind everyone of how far they'd come. Just past the walking trail at the neighborhood park entrance stood a bronze statue of Grandpa leaning against the fender of a stylized version of his truck. It wasn't a perfect likeness, it was more cartoonish than anything, but it captured the essence of the story. The plaque beneath it read, "For standing tall when it mattered most." At first, Grandpa just stared at it, speechless. Then he chuckled and said, That better not be life-size, or I need to eat more biscuits." Everyone laughed and a few people wiped away tears. It wasn't just a statue, it was a symbol. A reminder that one person really can make a difference when they refuse to be bullied, when they choose justice over fear, and when they do it all without losing their sense of humor. As the stars came out and the last ribs disappeared from the grill, Grandpa stood in front of his truck one last time and looked around. The same houses, the same lawns, but a different spirit, a free one, a united one. And as the night wound down and people headed home with full stomachs and fuller hearts, he climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine purred to life, and the headlights cut through the evening mist. He didn't drive far. Just a slow lap around the park, waving at neighbors and tapping the horn twice. A gentle reminder that he was still here. That the truck was still here. That the soul of the community had come back, shinier and stronger than ever. And as the convoy of good memories faded into the night, one thing was certain. They might tow a truck, but they'd never tow the man behind the wheel. Not then. Not now. Not ever.